Hello, everybody. I am Kirsten, and I am one half of the Christian jazz pop duo Zoetic. This YouTube channel is made up of two types of videos: our original music videos, where we create Christian culture, and long form videos, such as this one, where we kind of talk about Christian culture. We post these long form videos every other Thursday, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And you can also find this video as a podcast at the link below. Today, we're doing something a little different. I'm doing a collaborative interview with my friend and colleague, Jacob Davis. As just like a little fun aside, Jacob and I knew each other briefly when we were kids because we were both missionary kids in Germany at a school called Black Forest Academy. So this is kind of a cool full circle moment. Maybe at some point we will talk about the MK life and everything that goes into that, but that is not the purpose of the podcast today. Today, we are going to be talking about worship music, basically the music that is performed and sung in church and worship teams and kind of that whole aspect. I believe Jacob and I have both served on worship teams many times. But first, Jacob, do you want to kind of introduce yourself and talk about who you are, what you do, all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jacob Davis. I'm a singer-songwriter, worship leader. I've been writing songs and leading worship for about 19 years now, and I've been in a variety of different denominations. I tell people doctrinal background-wise, 'cause that's usually a question that they ask, that I'm a Reformed charismatic. So a lot of our conversation tends to be, well, how does that work? But I love talking about worship music and worship doctrine and just the ethos of it. I currently teach at Visible Music College as a professor, and I'm also working in a local high school. So a lot of my world is either teaching or playing music or leading worship. So
Awesome. Does Reformed charismatic, just taking a guess at that, does that mean like Calvinist, but also you believe in the continuation of the Holy Spirit? Is that kind of what it is? Or
yes. So
I
I
mean the continuation of the
probably
Holy Spirit.
yeah,
Continuation of the gifts of the Spirit
right.
versus cessationist. Yeah.
Right, right. So I'm like I probably interpret tulip slightly differently, but I'm definitely close to a 4 pointer
Okay.
on most days, but I am a full continualist.
Okay.
So
All right.
it
Well,
can
we
be
agree on half of it. We agree on the continuous part. The reformed part we may have to discuss, but no,
sure, sure. It's okay.
that's another podcast for another day. That gets spicy real quick, of course. So,
It
um,
can be. I feel like it's
yeah,
unnecessary because we're all part of the body,
yeah,
and
I agree. I
it's
agree.
better if we just have discussions about it and be loving to
Yeah,
each other.
yeah, absolutely. I think it's just a fun discussion. I don't think it's a in-house discussion, as we like to say. So,
Hmm.
um, all right. So I have talked a lot about the Christian music industry. I just did an interview on the Church Split YouTube channel
Hmm.
about that exact subject, but there's a subset of that industry that I have not talked about in depth that we hope to talk about today, and that is worship music specifically. We're going to have an interesting discussion about worship music, worship
Hmm.
teams, and I want to clarify something. Worship music and Christian music are not necessarily the same. Now, all worship music should be Christian music, ideally, right? Unless it's worship
Hmm.
music in a different religion. But not all Christian music is worship music. So, worship music is music that is specifically designed to be sung by a church congregation. So, that means that the lyrics, the chords, the melody, need to be simple enough for your average congregation to be able to sing along with it, right? And so, for example, like Zoetic, like our song Worth It, is a Christian song, and it is worshipful in nature. It points people to Jesus, but it isn't worship music. We wouldn't have a congregation sing it with us in church because the song is too complicated for your average congregant to be able to kind of follow along with it.
Mm.
And so like a lot of people will object to these differing terms, but I think they are important because it allows some Christian artists, such as ourselves, to make music that is as complicated as we want, without necessarily feeling like it has to be written for a church congregation. There can be a blurring of the lines, but for the most part, there should be like kind of two different camps there. So to reiterate one more time, we're going to be talking about worship music specifically, which is music that is sung in church. And so the first question that I kind of want to bring up is, do you think that worship music, how do you think it's evolved over time? We used to kind of have just hymns, right? And then
Hmm.
we had more contemporary worship music start to happen. So how have you seen it kind of evolve over time? And do you think it's evolved in a good direction, or do you think there are some things that maybe we could go back to? Like, what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. So I think to answer like the first part of that question, we started in the 70s. It was kind of like wild, wild west. So
Mhm.
you had different people like throwing a verse or a chorus together or a pre-chorus, and it's some of the stuff was pretty easy to sing along to, and some of it wasn't easy to sing along to.
Yeah,
And that's just because there hadn't really been a you know uh, Christian like CCM had not really existed
wasn't
at
an
that point.
industry yet. Yeah,
Yeah, it wasn't an industry. You had churches that were doing gospel, and you had some Southern gospel, and you had some very early, variations. But Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill and those guys with Maranatha kind of hit the scene with Chuck Smith, and that's where it starts. In the '80s, you kind of get the verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus thing going on, and by the '90s, you begin to see some more pop format. But
mhm,
where we're at today is essentially we've married corporate worship with the standard pop format. So standard pop format, for everybody to know, just so we have some background here. That means that the song is going to have a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus or double
mhm.
chorus form. It's
Yeah.
probably going to be in the key of G or key of C. It might be in a handful of other keys, give or take.
If
Um,
the guitarist can capo, they
if the
may put it
guitarist could capo.
they may put it in other keys,
Sure,
and then
sure.
have the pianist suffer along as if they don't have a
Right.
transpose button. Yeah.
I just think it's ridiculous that most of our worship songwriters are writing in B and no one can
Yeah.
sing in B. And,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
most of our people are baritones or altos.
Right.
But that's the format, and it's usually 3.5 minutes long. And even the chord choices are specific too. So, like,
Yeah, I would say the only exception I would say to that is you see this a little bit more with Hillsong and Bethel, where you have these really long
yep.
worship songs that are longer than anything else you're gonna find in Christian music. It's kinda interesting that I mean, they'll go to the 12-minute mark
Hmm.
sometimes. I mean,
Yep. 100%.
yeah,
We might get into that today with some of
yeah,
the other questions. But
yeah,
is it a good thing? Is I think the second part of your question, and I think that's a mixed bag answer, right? I think we've made corporate worship music has become very approachable, right? It's easy to access and it's easy to teach, but a lot of it, I think, is not theologically sound. There's a lot of milk going on. It's definitely not creative, and it's certainly not inspiring.
yeah,
Um, if you're just looking at it from a logical earthly standpoint, right? But I'm also questioning like how much and this is more coming from my background, but like how many of these songs are crafted in a room in a way where like God's not in the middle of the crafting, and how
mhm,
many of them are we actually submitting to the Lord and allowing him to lead us?
mhm,
Because I think a lot of these tunes are, people sat down for 30 minutes and they were
mhm.
trying to make a buck and they were trying to make a hit.
Right.
So,
Wrote for marketability instead of, um, what it's supposed to be written for. And it's tough to know, sometimes exactly what the genesis process of these songs are.
mhm,
To just kind of jump off of what you were saying, you know, sometimes I will have people say to me, "Don't you wish, as a jazz musician, don't you wish worship music was more complicated?" And I think my answer to that is no, because do want it to be approachable by
mhm,
your average congregation. And I think if you make worship too musically complicated, it's going to be tough, especially for small churches. you know, we'll get into this a little bit later, but small churches don't hire musicians outside of their church. by the way, nor should they. I think it's good that they're using the people inside their church. But if they are a small congregation, that means they have less people to kind of pick from.
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
you get more amateur musicians, which there is absolutely no issue with that, but that's what you're going to get. And so it's important that the songs are relatively simple in a musical sense. And I think that's okay as long as there's Christian music outside of what's being sung congregationally that is more complicated. I think that's fine. To me, the biggest issue is kind of, you hinted at it, you touched on it, but the theological depth kind of being
mhm,
lost out of some of these songs. Um, there are some hymns that are complicated to play, but there are some
mm,
hymns that are quite simple. They're not difficult
mhm,
to play at
mhm,
all, but they're rich and beautiful and give a very dynamic gospel presentation.
mhm.
And I've appreciated, even though I'm not reformed, I appreciate like Sovereign Grace
Right.
because I think they've tried to bring that to a like almost like a modernized hymn
Mhm,
format, right?
mhm.
Like have you kind of noticed that with Sovereign Grace and some people in that camp?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. I'm actually it's funny. So I'm gonna go ahead and say the Reformed charismatic movement is not united. It hasn't
Mm,
been for 20
okay.
years. Sovereign Grace are actually part of it. So
Okay.
they're kind of like the OG. But I think from a hymn perspective, yeah, like I think they're doing a good job of okay, can we be theologically accurate? Can we make it singable, but also not boring and also
Yeah.
be kind of creative? So I think they do a good job. There's also a conference. I think it's called the Blue Hymn Conference. I might have the name wrong, but it's in
Mhm.
Nashville.
Okay.
And a lot of these major hymn writers, including Sovereign Grace or Lars Story or Matt Mayer, um, a lot of these guys come and they're trying to write basically like modern hymns to kind
Mhm.
of bring some new life into it. Um, but yeah, I think there's a way to do that. I'm not against hymns, but I'm also not going to say I only want hymns. I
Yeah.
think from my studies and my personal walk with Jesus and getting into Greek and Hebrew and all that, there's 31 words for worship in the Old New Testament, and several of the words say we need to be singing a new song unto the Lord,
Mhm.
like
Yep.
several of them.
Yep.
Including there's a one called Ode, which is the word for spiritual songs in Colossians 3, where it says sings hymns, songs, and spiritual songs to one another. That means to sing a new song unto the Lord. It's a new
Yeah.
spontaneous song. So, um, but yeah, I think people are doing well with
Yeah,
that.
I agree with you. I don't think I'm not in the camp of we should only be singing old songs or we only need to be singing even in the hymn format.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I don't because hymns usually sometimes they are verse, chorus, verse, chorus. Sometimes they're just verses. Like it's just
Mm-hmm.
basically verse after verse.
Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly care about the song structure. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a stickler on that. Like
Mm.
I'm fine with a pop structure in worship
Yeah.
music.
Yeah.
You can still have theologically deep and rich songs that have that pop structure. I think just taking some of the lyricism from hymns and
Mm-hmm.
bringing that into newer formats or newer types of worship songs, that's what I would like to see. I am not a hymn only type of person. I love
Mm-hmm.
hymns. I think they should be used. I don't think they should be neglected.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to just compromise with that, it's more of just like what can we learn from the hymn format, if that makes
Right.
sense. And I think the rich lyricism is what we can take.
Right.
And I don't think that every worship song needs to be incredibly deep theologically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, I think you might have something to say about this, but there's been a lot of talk about like having me-centered worship songs versus
Yeah.
having like God
Mm-hmm.
centered worship songs.
Mm-hmm.
And so there can be worship songs that are relatively simple lyrically, but
Mm-hmm.
just trying to make them more focused on God because he's the one ultimately that we're worshiping, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. No, there's three different kinds of of songs, at least from a textual perspective in terms of who's singing to who, right, in the scripture. So you have man singing to God. This is our vertical form of worship. This is, our primary, right? And you
Mm.
see that in the Psalms with David and some of the writers. Then you have God singing to man, which is almost
Mm.
more prophetic and teaching to people.
Yeah.
And then you have the occasional song that's man to man where we're encouraging the body, right?
Mm. Yes. Yes.
And so I think, those psalms were sung corporately, and they have been sung corporately. So I think it's a matter of, you know, if we have all three on a Sunday, which you're going to have 3 to 4 songs every Sunday, give or take,
Yeah.
unless your church wants a little more, a little less, depends on the
Yeah.
background. So like my church, I go to Christian Life Church. It's a Assemblies of God church. Known them for a while, and we do 3 to 4 songs on the front end and one song on the back end, and typically in those songs, the majority of them are man singing to God. And then there's maybe 1 or 2 songs at the end that are God kind of singing to man, where we're trying to emphasize a particular doctrinal point. But yeah, that's kind of, I think maybe the ratio should probably be like 60 to 70% is man to God. You
Mm.
know, maybe there's like 10-20% it's God to man, and maybe 10 to 10 is man to man. Like, they'll know we're Christians by our love is a man to man
Yeah.
worship song. So
My my question to you that I'm interested in hearing your perspective on, because I believe Assemblies of God, I'm not in that denomination, but I would is
sure.
that more Pentecostal, right? Is that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
in
So
that vein?
AG is Pentecostal.
Okay.
I like to think that they're the doctrinally sound Pentecostal,
Mm.
because they really appreciate sound theology and
Mm.
all that.
So my question for you out of that is, um, what do you think about songs like, I mean, the one that's coming to my mind right now, and this is just an example, but like Set Afire by Jesus Culture, where it's
Yeah,
like really repetitive,
yeah.
in terms of that. Because I've heard some Christians be like, that can be a great way to kind of meditate on
Mhm,
God, and
mhm.
other Christians have criticized it for kind of like being vain repetitions or whatever. But
Yeah,
then you see like all the angels in Revelation, like
yep,
repeating themselves when they say, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, and
right.
they just kind of repeat. So I'm just kind of curious as to your perspective on songs like that that are kind of repeating similar lines over and over.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, I love that song. I've played the mess out of that song for for 10 years. Um, but yeah, I'm not against it. I think it's all about context. And one of our
Mm.
things that we're going to talk about a little later is performance-based worship culture and presence-based worship culture. And I think the cornerstone question for me, which I think is a separation question, is okay, what is God looking for us to do in this moment? What's the direction
Mm.
that the Lord has for us this week? Are we getting just one word? Do we have like
Mm.
5 pages worth of direction from God? Where is He leading us in this moment? And then once I know the answer to that question, does the song fit for that? So, Set a Fire itself, it's all focusing on like um, about the love of God and wanting more of the Lord. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a really good closer song.
Mm.
So when I've led it, I'm usually have like a theologically rich tune, like Nothing But the Blood of Jesus,
Yes.
or Cornerstone, Christ Alone, something like that. That's on the front end. So we're setting the table right in worship.
Mm.
So here's our sound doctrine. Here's our Apostle Creed, our Nicene Creed. Okay, now there's a second song or third song that I'm talking about a specific issue. Maybe it's forgiveness, maybe it's faith, maybe we're talking about how the Lord delivers us from different things that are spiritual. And Set a Fire, it's just a really good altar song. It's a good tag to
Yeah.
throw in there with I
So
Exalt Thee.
I want to just see if I'm summarizing your perspective correctly, because I think it's really interesting, which is you think that those songs have a place, but you said it's about the context that surrounds them. It's like, are we
Mhm.
only singing songs like that? Or are we
Mhm.
putting it um in the midst of other songs that maybe do have a more in-depth theological message? Is that kind of what you're saying, more or less?
100%.
Okay.
100%. Mhm.
Yeah, I like that. I think that that's, really good. And I think, um, for me, and I think you would probably agree with this, not all songs that are simple, like Set a Fire or something, are theologically bad,
Mm.
necessarily. Like,
Mhm.
I'm against, I'm gonna bring up a specific song, and I don't know if this is gonna be a point of contention between us or not, but bringing up the song like Reckless Love. I'm not a big fan of that phrasing.
Sure.
I don't like the idea of God um doing things recklessly. If anything, God is the most purposeful being in all of the
Right.
universe, right? So I have a little bit of a theological deal with that song, right?
Mhm.
But it's not because the song is simple. It's because I think the phrasing itself is reckless. I think that there
Mhm.
is a lack of care in terms of phrasing that theologically. But I think it's important that, although I prefer theologically rich songs, that
Mhm.
Christians are not too judgmental, and that we recognize that there might be a place for songs that maybe are a little more repetitive or are simpler, as long as they are not, you know, wrong in their theology. Does that make
Right.
sense?
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't consider that a point of contention. I've definitely thought about that lyric. I have other songs that bother me more than
Mhm.
that one, 'cause I think that particular song, the verses and some of the other lyrics are contextually good. It's just
Yeah.
that that particular phrase is not the greatest choice, is probably how I would say it.
Yeah.
But there are other songs that do really bother me.
Mm.
Um,
Do you have
there
any
is
examples off the top of your head?
I think it's Holy Spirit by Brian and Katie Torwalt. That one really bothers me.
Is that
Um,
the Holy Spirit, You Are Welcome Here song?
yeah, that bothers me. I get what we're trying to say,
Yeah.
but God's omnipresent, and
Yes.
even for a
Yeah.
person like
Yeah.
me that, like, yeah, I do believe in the baptism of the Spirit, and I've
Yeah.
seen pretty much everything except for someone being raised from the dead. So, like, I have
Mhm.
physical evidence plus the scripture to back up some of these things. But like when I look at that particular song, you know, where, Holy Spirit, you're welcome here, come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. I'm like, okay, I get that we're trying to talk about the manifest presence of God, but we probably could say this a better way. And
Yeah.
that's a hard topic to, like, because God's everywhere at all at once. And
Yes.
he's trying to get at the idea of the tangible presence of the Lord. When God's doing something, we can physically see it going on or whatever. But I just feel like that's poor judgment on that particular
Yeah, I've
writer.
also that lyric has nagged at me as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a couple of others that I could think of. One song that I really hate bringing up because I love the song, but
Mm-hmm.
the song Above All, which I
Okay.
think is just beautiful. But like, there's that line, like a rose trampled on the ground, that's fine, but you took the fall and thought of me above all. It's a little that leans a little, kind of man center. You can pick at that. There's another one
Yeah.
that's like, um, I can't remember the name of it, but I think it's What a Beautiful Name. And it's
Yeah.
the second verse of that, and it's like, you didn't want heaven without us. So
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, you brought heaven down, and it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
it's almost implying like a neediness of God, and that he wouldn't be
Mm.
fulfilled within his own Trinity,
Mm.
which I think is kind of, I wouldn't word it that way,
Sure.
probably.
Sure. Sure.
I think there are very few worship songs that are absolutely blatantly heretical. There
Mm-hmm.
probably are a couple, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But just, I think we agree that, if you're writing worship music, you should be extra conscientious
Yes.
um of the wording you're going to be using, because Christians are going to be singing it
Mm-hmm.
in church. Not that artists like, Zoetic, like, not that we shouldn't be conscientious, we should.
Right.
Um but I think it's a different level when you're writing music for that other Christians are going to be singing in church. There's a high level of accountability there.
For
Yeah.
sure, for sure. No, I definitely in agreement with that. It bugs me sometimes because I just think people aren't being careful. we're
Yeah.
just we're just making music to make music. I'm like, time out, hold up. Have we thought
Yeah.
about this song yet?
Exactly. So that moves me into my second question for you. And you know, when you kind of contacted me and talked about wanting to have a discussion, which I thought was awesome. You talked to me on the phone a little bit about like this performative versus presence based worship type of thing, and I don't know if I'd ever heard it quite put that way. So I'm really interested in, I know that's something you wanted to talk about. So can you just kind of give us the crash course in what that is?
For sure, for sure. Yeah, so there's two different kinds of worship culture in the entire world. You can narrow it down to these two different names. There's performance-based worship culture and presence-based worship culture. Performance-based worship culture has an ethos that does not look for the direction of God specifically. It's just picking what's popular, what's going to get people in seats, what fits with the sermon. It's very logical and earthly focused. And because of that, the corporate time of worship is all about the corporate time of worship. It becomes a show. It becomes a showcase, and it uses excellence to try to create this kind of dancing monkey sort of attraction for people. Um, so you have that kind of worship culture, and then you have presence-based worship culture where um, the leadership is saying, "Lord, we want whatever you want," and they seek God's direction, including that means the songs that are picked, that means how the flow is happening on a Sunday, that means who's on the stage, that means what they're doing, even the way things are presented, and even if God just gives like a simple word or you know a nudging in a direction, whether it's that or a whole bunch of clarity with pages, worth of clarity. That church is willing to wait to have God give direction, and then they follow through. Um, both cultures can have excellence. Both cultures can be highly performative, quote unquote, like having high production that we've talked about. But the difference is that the people with presence based worship culture, they're all about we want the Lord, we want him to be active, we want to submit to what his preferred will is. Whereas the other folks are just like, well, we're just going to worship Jesus and we're just going to do the thing. And
Mhm.
whether that's what we need to be doing in the moment or not. Um,
Is this difference something that would be evident from the outside, like if you were a congregant? Or is this something that you can only really tell if you're on staff, if you're on the worship team kind of from the inside? Does that question make sense?
for sure, 100%. No, you can tell. You can definitely tell. So if and I think the markers are even in how the worship leaders lead. If you feel like they're constantly trying to get you to do something,
Mhm.
right? Um, that's performance based worship culture. In presence based worship culture, they might invite you, but there's no pressure
Mm,
because the people are completely consumed with worshiping Jesus. They couldn't care, it's
mhm,
not about that. So the ethos are different. So presence based worship culture, we're going to pick whatever songs God leads us to pick, and we're just going to entrust that these are the songs that people need to be singing, and God will do it, right?
mm.
Whereas the other, it's like highly meticulous, and we're trying to get people to engage, and that is like the goal. Can we get people to clap? Can we get them to stand? Can we get them to do whatever? Um, you know, and anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
You had a
it seems
question.
it I was just gonna ask, like, it seems like this performative versus presence thing also, I mean, this is a little bit beyond the purview of the video, but it wouldn't just apply to worship music, but it also would apply to preaching,
Yep.
or it would apply to the other functions of the church. I mean, I've talked a lot. We've even written songs. Our song "Imposter" is about, you know, really seeker friendly churches that
Yep.
it's not that you shouldn't be inviting and welcoming. Of course you should, as a church, but like almost doing whatever it takes just to get people in the door
Right.
type of thing. And so do you think that there's this dichotomy in other areas of the church, not just in like corporate worship or singing?
Oh, hands down. No, it's definitely it is become pervasive, and you can tell by putting on any live stream. We could start pulling them up if we were hanging out. Like, yep, no, that's performance, that's presence, that's performance, and it's not like denominationally rooted
Yeah.
either. So you can have the same denomination, two different churches, and one's performance and one's presence based.
Mm.
Um, so it's all going to be in. Do you sense people making it about the Lord?
Mhm.
And is there room for God to move or act or speak? Can the boat be rocked by the Lord if He desires to do so? You know. So
Yeah.
things are held with an open hand. Whereas performance is like, this is exactly when we're doing it at 2:55. Y'all are going
Yeah.
out there. You're going to set up. You're going to
Yes.
tune your instruments at
Right.
30, 31:25. You're going to come back on after the sermon, and Billy Bob's going to start playing keys, and he's going to play the opening track from Rattle or whatever. And those are the two different things present.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a I think what you're getting at is there's a controlling aspect
Mm-hmm.
of the performance-based worship type thing where it's us thinking that we can control
Yep.
how many people come into our churches, that we, instead of us planting the seeds and God, bringing the fruit, or God,
Mm-hmm.
bringing about who he's going to bring in. It's how many people can we get in? And if we make
Yep.
this change, can we get more people? I will say, although I do think it's apparent, when you see this as a congregant, I've also been on staff at churches. I think it becomes really apparent when you're on staff and you kind
Oh
of,
yeah.
get to see how the sausage gets made, no pun intended, but um where I led worship at a church very briefly. I'm not going to get into the whole deal about why I wasn't able to make that a longer term thing, but I was there for about 3 months, and every week I would go to the staff meeting, and it was like we would talk about how many people we have and how to get more people. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
was really kind of gross. It felt gross to me. It felt like, we have 250 people, but that isn't good enough. Instead of
Yeah.
kind of like, how do we, because the thing is that if you focus on spiritually feeding the 250 people you have, they're gonna bring more people. Like, it that the number issue will take care of itself if you focus on ministering to the people you already have, instead of thinking about how do I constantly get new people in the door. um
Right.
and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have an evangelistic mindset, or that we shouldn't want to share the gospel. Of course we should,
Yeah.
but often the gospel isn't the tool that's being employed to get people in the door. It's usually, you know, food trucks or a hayride, or, a specific, like you alluded to, the specific type of worship that is being utilized, that's very, very high production value. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing things excellently. But it's just more about like the heart behind it. So I get where you're coming from. This is something that I've definitely taken issue with, where and by the way, it's something that Emma and I, you know, God has changed our hearts on this too. Now, we're not a
Mm.
church, obviously, so it's a different deal, but more just basically like, how can we best minister to the platform God has already given us,
Mm.
rather than how do we constantly try to get bigger numbers of people to be more impressive? Like,
Mm.
that part of it is something that Emma and I have had to let go of
Mm.
um over the years, and I think that that is something that churches should consider letting go of as well. The numbers that you have, just take care of the flock you've been given. Don't incessantly be looking for ways to get more people in, you know?
100%. Now, I agree with you. Like, it definitely works itself out in present
Yeah.
space because you're like you're meeting the needs of the people, and our America, like the church in America right now, is starving because we have all these baby believers that are under discipled,
Mhm.
and we're not bringing mature sermons, we're not bringing mature worship songs, we're not
Mm,
making enough small groups for folks. We
mm.
talk about other people's books, and we're not talking about the Bible enough. Like,
Amen on
it's
that.
just,
Gosh.
like the biblical literacy is redonkulous. And,
Yeah.
when you go performance based, this is really harsh what I'm about to say. This is
No,
really
go ahead.
harsh. Um, when you go performance based, ultimately you make the people in your seats idols
Mm, yeah. I
because
don't think that's I think that's true. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I feel like it's harsh because, but that's all. I'm only saying that because like the majority of churches in America do it. Like,
Yeah.
because it's the whole church growth model, but it's like the bad side. This is what kind of
Yeah.
what happens because it's like jumping into the CIA. Like, once you're in the CIA, you're in the CIA, and like you're
Mm,
not out. I was only
yeah.
thinking about that because I watched the CIA show like the last week and binged it. But like that concept is true because like you have to keep secrets, right?
Yeah.
So it just continues to spiral. Is kind of what I'm saying.
Well, and I think, not that I think if the church wants to learn one lesson from corporate America, and again, I'm not a big fan of the church emulating corporate America, but I'm going to say if you're looking at that, then the lesson that you should learn from that, I think, is that, you know, w- products and companies that get massive,
Yeah.
um, they tell the customers what they need. They don't look to incessantly please their customers. It's like, with the iPhone, I mean, that was what Steve Jobs was infamous for, was this hasn't been invented yet, but we're going to tell you what you need. You don't tell us what you need, you don't know. We're going to tell you. And I think with the church, we should maybe even strive to take that attitude a little bit more, which is just, you need the gospel. We know what you need. And I mean, not in such a demanding way, but just basically like, we have what you need already. And that is Christ. That is Jesus.
Yeah.
That is the gospel. And
Yeah.
so instead of looking at what you want from us and us trying to be people pleasy and pander to that, it's more of like, we're going to show you why we are different,
Yeah.
why we are going to give you something you can't find somewhere else. I say that all the time. Um, and so it's like, it's funny because that's a lesson they could actually learn from from successful businesses, is that successful businesses, it's not that they never take customer feedback, but they're innovating. They're going to tell you the new thing that you need. It's not, the other way around, I guess.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. So this kind of leads into my third point. It leads really naturally into that, which is just this concept of high production worship. We've already kind of alluded to this. And the bigger the church, the more I see this being a thing,
Yep.
where worship needs to corporate worship on Sundays needs to almost be like a concert. Concerts or shows for major artists, we all know they're a high production, high budget deal. They have to
Yeah.
be, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we see this now in mega churches, but even in churches that are not mega churches but are just large, maybe
Yeah.
churches that have three or more services, or things like that, where you have these massive productions. The musicians, they use clicks in
Yep.
ear, or they have guide tracks. Again, I don't have anything wrong necessarily with the click.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm just saying what is part of this. You could have a lot of lighting. I've seen smoke machines in churches like this.
Mhm.
um I've seen on the extreme end, mega churches, um hiring non-Christian musicians to be on stage, or even just musicians that don't go to their church. I've been basically offered jobs by mega churches in my area,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a professional musician, and luckily I am a Christian, but I have friends who are not Christians who are employed by these churches. I'm not going to go into who or where, but
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, they're incredibly gifted musicians, which is why these churches hire them, but they're not Christians. And it's like you
Mm.
don't know with some of these mega churches who on stage actually is a Christian or who is a part of your church. You
Mm.
would presume that the singers probably are, you
Yeah.
know. Um, but the bassist that shows up on a random Sunday, you may not know, you know?
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, how important is it for worship on Sunday mornings to have that high production level? And is there a point where there is too much of a focus on that,
Yeah.
I guess?
That's a great question. Yeah. Hmm. It's tough answering the first. My short response is it's not important.
Mm,
um, because like, what is worship?
mhm,
We have to answer that question first. Well, worship, there's 31 words to worship, Old New Testament. The New Testament word latreia means service to God or ministry to God, right? So if I'm serving the Lord and ministering to the Lord, um, as long as I'm inviting and I'm leading the people of God to do that, whether it's with an acoustic guitar in a crummy looking 90s church that's all white walls with some flags that are 50 years old, and
mhm.
whether it's there and the building's falling apart or I'm in the 10,000 seater, as long as I have the appropriate heart and I'm teaching people accurately and I'm following the spirit, I think that's good. um, Now I will say that um, there are certain things that are helpful in the high production world. Like if you have a band, even if it's a small band, let's say I was just thinking about this the other day because I was thinking about another particular podcast and maybe making a series on this. But let's say we're at a church of 400 people, and Billy's the worship leader. He's been a worship leader for 5 years. Little Bobby is a 15-year-old bass player in khaki shorts, and Miss Merrill plays piano. Um, Brother Doug was a metal drummer and he got saved and he's playing drums, and that's it. It's a bass player, piano, drummer, and our worship leader who's probably playing electric guitar to try to fill the space, right? It might be good if there's an MD to kind of hold the line down, you know, uh, in that band, or if the band got a little bit bigger. But if it's just a singer and a vocalist and another instrumentalist, you don't need that,
Yeah.
right? You don't need that. Click is helpful to keep the band on structure, but like even in our church, like our church is about 1,000 people, and we've got 2 services. Click's kind of helpful to kind of keep the boat moving along. Um, Now tracks, I have more problems with tracks than I do with click and guide and
Do you mean
pads, but
backing tracks?
mhm,
Like, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, like we were talking about it in my master's degree. I finished my master's in December, and
Congrats.
thank you. I appreciate that. In one of my classes, we were talking about um, the church and media, I think was the course. And we were talking about backing tracks, and the professor essentially said, the thing about backing tracks is even though it's helpful when there's nobody at church to fill the position, if I have a church where there's a guy that fills the position, I shouldn't use it because that tells him that he's replaceable.
Mm.
And
Yes.
so that's kind of my issue with tracks is like, okay, it's nice to have some auxiliary like pads going on, but I don't want to take the place of anybody that's bringing their gift to the Lord.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely on what you said about that. Like to go in a little more in depth on my position on this type of stuff. So, I think that we should strive to lead worship with excellence.
Hmm.
But excellence looks different depending on the congregation and the needs that you have. Our congregation, I go to an Anglican church and we've got
Mm.
like 230 people. Um, And our worship team is tiny. It is, a guitarist who's our vocalist and main leader.
Mhm.
It's me and it's 2 other ladies. We actually this is totally random, but we have an all-female worship team, which is kinda rad. Um,
Yo,
not
that's cool.
not by design at all, it just happens to be that way. But anyways, regardless, yeah, it's we don't use Click, and I think Click can be good. I'm not against it in
Mhm.
principle.
Mhm.
I think it's better in bigger church situations.
Yep.
With our church, the issue is that because our team is so small, sometimes the congregation can almost overpower the team where they
Yep.
sing so loud that they're gonna pick the tempo, and Click would actually be detrimental for us because if they pick the tempo and it's too slow, it becomes like a power struggle where we have to over assert the tempo that is
Mhm.
the click instead of just kinda going along with it, which unfortunately is what we have to do because our church is
Yeah.
tiny and our team is tiny, therefore, and so the congregation can overpower us easily. I think in larger churches where you have a bigger space, um, maybe where the congregation is not heard as much from the stage, or something like that, then a click is more practical. Because then if you have, the equipment and large speakers to where you can assert the tempo, then that works. I don't have a problem with click in theory. I just think
Mhm.
it depends on the individual situation. I am
Mhm.
also not a fan of backing tracks. Just because I think it is important that worship is authentic,
Yeah.
as best as it
Yeah.
can be. Um, I think there is a point where the production level gets so high, it loses some of that. Um,
Yeah.
and when we lead with excellence, what does that mean? I mean, to me, what that means is that we choose our songs with excellence, like what you said with the guidance of God, right? That's
Mhm.
the first thing. Song choice is really, really important,
Mhm.
more important than production. Um, and that we can play the songs competently, like relatively well enough to be able to lead the congregation. And that can become difficult when you have small churches where there are musicians with massive differentials in skill. Some that are like beginner musicians, they're going to have a steeper learning curve
Yep.
than people who are a lot more experienced. But yeah, I think that there is a way to lead worship with excellence, even if it's just a guitarist who sings. You're
Yeah.
one guitarist, you sing, you don't have a click. You can still lead with excellence. Leading with excellence doesn't mean that you have a 10-person band hiring people from the outside, smoke machines, lights, all of that. think um I don't think that is necessary to lead the congregation in powerful worship. I think with the lights and the smoke and stuff like that, I don't I don't necessarily have a problem with it in theory.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think again it depends on the context. In my church that would be really weird.
Sure.
But in some other churches it's I guess a little more normal. Um my only thing about it, and this is just more of like a yellow flag with it, is I'm wondering if it's manufacturing a mood too much. Like if you
Yeah.
have the lighting and the smoke in order to like conjure up this emotional experience in people.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I don't have like a super hard line stance on that, but I
Sure.
have kind of wondered about that.
Yeah, smoke machines crack me up. I have a funny story on a smoke machine from last year. Uh, but yeah, to answer your question, and I can give the short story after that. But I think lights can be helpful if we're not like making crazy colors on the wall. Like that can be kind of helpful for the band to be able to see. It's mostly for
Yes.
pictures because it's mainly for like advertising the church and like showing people what they do. And I think to a degree that's kind of important because people should kind of know.
Yeah,
But I don't.
particularly if your
Yeah,
church is not to cut you off, but
sure.
particularly if your church is dark, like
Yeah.
if it's dark in the room. My church is not, so we don't have that
Mhm.
like particular issue. But I agree, like obviously you need lighting for the musicians if the church is dark and you can't see, that's like a practical
Right.
consideration.
That's a
Yeah.
practical thing. The smoke
Yeah.
machine thing kinda cracks me up. That's kind of a youth group leftover influence thing with the whole, like, 2000s youth group band
Mhm.
era. Are you pretty familiar with that era?
I mean, I was in youth group in the 2000s, so
Okay.
I mean, yes, to a degree.
Yeah.
I never led youth group or anything like that, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. Like, for me, and I was talking about this with a small group that I lead with these musicians, like, I kinda grew up with all the changes happening. You
Mhm.
know? So, like, we were doing wedges and the lighting was still janky as all get out of BFA, and, like, the sound system was a load of hot garbage, and we were still playing Vineyard tunes and, like, early Hillsong, and by the time I got into high school and I went to Florida, Smoke Machine had become a thing,
Mhm.
Jesus Culture was definitely a thing, and everything was a little more punk rock edgy. And then by the time I graduated, we'd gone into weird ethereal pop shoegaze.
Yeah.
But at some point in there, people thought the smoke machine was a good idea to have. And I was in one of our worship nights at a ministry that I serve in called Generate. It's like a young adult worship ministry. Um, and they put together these worship nights, and it's multi-denominational, multi-church. I think there's like 25 churches represented now, so it's pretty wild. But we did an event at the home church for the organization, and they don't use a smoke machine very often, but they have a smoke machine. And somebody on the team, I'm not going to rat him out, uh, left the smoke machine going for 4 or 5 hours and filled up the entire the entire room was covered in smoke machine, and it set the fire alarm off
And
at the very
amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the worship set, it set the fire alarm off, and it was going to the click in the last
See,
song.
that's when, as a worship leader, that's when you improvise and you play Set a Fire. You
Yeah,
just switch to that song in your set
dude,
because it's already going on at that point, you know?
it was so humid and so hot, and I sweat my shirt out, and we ended the night with "Free" by SEU Worship, and I was just,
Okay.
like, done.
Incredible. Incredible. Yeah, so maybe consider whether or not to use the smoke machine because you can leave it on for 5 hours and then everybody is coughing and it's a whole deal. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I am not gonna be legalistic and go on here and say that
Sure.
high production endeavors in worship are always wrong or always sinful. I don't necessarily think that's the case.
Mhm.
But I wanna move away from the fact that simplicity in worship teams, is worse somehow. Like, the idea that you could just have one person leading from their heart
Mhm.
skillfully with a guitar and their
Yeah.
voice or piano and their voice,
Yeah.
um, and there isn't lights, there isn't smoke, there isn't a click, there isn't a guide track, there isn't backing tracks, there isn't any of this stuff, um, and that they still can't do that with excellence and that people still can't worship as powerfully. They can. They can. I've seen it happen. Where it's just one person leading from their heart,
Yeah.
leading in that presence-based worship that you alluded to earlier of,
Mhm.
you can tell that the songs were picked intentionally, with the leading of the Holy Spirit. And I just think that that is also okay. There isn't just one cookie cutter
Yeah.
excellent that we all need to be striving for, and it's these high budget, high production type of things. Um, because leading a congregation is very different than putting on a show. Those
Yeah.
are two very different things. Um, it's not about entertaining a congregation, it's about leading them effectively and giving them the space to be
Yes.
able to sing loudly, and really give their hearts in worship to God. And I think that you and I would probably both agree with that. And that can be done. That can be done with high
Mhm.
production endeavors.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think just being careful, that you're not losing a ton of authenticity, when you
Yeah.
go to those higher budget things. Do you have any final
100%.
thoughts on that
Oh,
subject
oh
specifically?
yeah. For specifically, I mean, it kind of gets into your other question a little bit, but I think we should put our efforts more into the content we're bringing
Yeah.
and less on the production and the packaging of the content. To
Mhm.
use like business terms, like what are the songs that I'm bringing? Did I actually take time with the Lord? Did I actually seek direction? What is the scripture that I'm being led to share? What testimony am I being led to give? Am I bringing excellence in that form? Because I think it should go there first and not so
Absolutely.
much, here's all these dope tracks and there's 102 tracks I'm going to play off this particular tune. And it's going to have 5 key changes and little Betsy is
Yeah.
going to rip a solo at the end. Like, what I mean? Like we need to kind of
Yeah.
switch that around a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I call it, sometimes I call this, like, all frosting, no cake, is sometimes how what I'll
yeah,
call it. Um,
yeah.
and this is something that I've said, not I don't wanna get into a big whole thing about broader Christian music,
Hmm.
um, day, but this is something I've talked a lot about with just Christian music in general, even just the
Hmm.
stuff that you're hearing on the radio, um, which is that, um, we need to make sure production is frosting, okay?
Yeah,
Production is important. I'm not saying it's not important, and your song is never gonna get anywhere if you don't have at least good production. But
yeah,
I just hear a lot of songs that have phenomenal production, but the songwriting is bad. Like, they haven't started with a good cake first. And so when you hear the song, it's like, okay, yeah, like it sounds good from a production standpoint, but it doesn't but the songwriting was rushed through, if that makes sense. And to me, that's a case of putting like a mound of giant sugary frosting, but like there's no cake, or the cake is bad, or you didn't take any time with it. The substance, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is not there. Which is why songwriting, in my opinion, is more important than production. Production is important. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but songwriting is more important. And I think
yeah.
conversely, in worship music, song choosing, because you're most of the time you're not going to be writing your own songs for the congregation to sing, although some people do, and that's awesome. But song choosing is more important than the production. If we don't spend the time needed in the word or with the Lord to ascertain what songs we're picking, then it doesn't matter how overly produced it is, and sometimes that can even work against the final product. So I totally agree with you there. I think there is
Yeah,
a rushing through on the song choosing
yeah.
and too much time spent on the final product, the execution, I guess. You know.
100%. We don't take the time to craft our songs in a way where we're inviting God to lead us, and we've lost innovation, we've lost creativity, but furthermore, like we don't read our Bible enough. We're just looking for
Right.
like the next clickbait,
Right.
which is
Exactly.
ridiculous. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'll get off the
Um
soapbox.
no, no, it's that you and I are both up there. Um, so the final question, because I kind of want to leave on like a hopeful note.
Yes.
I Some people will tell me that I just criticize all the time and don't offer, enough
Hmm.
solutions. Now I do think that, my music is a solution to to a degree.
Sure.
But not in worship music. It's not. We don't write a ton of worship music specifically. And so I think Jacob and I have kind of talked a little bit about some worship artists. I may have you name a few more. I mean, go and check out Jacob's original music as well. You're probably a little bit more in the worship camp than we are specifically. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, I guess the question is like, what is the solution? We've already kind of hit on it a little bit, but how do we change worship music and maybe the worship experience overall in our churches for the better?
Yeah, a great question. I have a different, maybe unique answer to this question. I think, uh, in the same way that Sam McCabe talks about getting rid of like the celebrityism that we have in our culture when it comes to the church, I think local churches need to start writing for local churches.
Hmm.
I think we need to say, you know what's going on in our church this week? Well, uh, Bob's going through a divorce. His wife, had an affair with yada yada, and little Susie Q's got cancer, and Miss May is taking care of her grandkids, and her son is kind of wayward right now. And we take all those things before the Lord. I'm like, okay, Lord, how can I speak to these people? How can I bring truth and bring love and bring your gospel into this moment for these people? Because
Mm,
I think original music written by local folks in a church will have way more impact than
mhm,
some person that's 10,000 miles away. Um, like hype is not, we can't equivocate hype with being anointed.
mm,
Um, like, that's ridiculous. Like, no, we can't say, okay, because there's momentum and hype behind this person, God has blessed them and there's favor upon what they're doing. That's not necessarily the case. I think maybe in a handful of cases that's true, but a lot of times it's performance-based worship culture. They are doing things to get people into the room rather than, Lord, what do you want? Like,
Well, if anything, I think sometimes, not always, by the way, don't misconstrue me and think I'm saying
sure,
always, but
sure,
sometimes it is actually a sign in the opposite direction. If somebody becomes massively popular or
right,
influential in Christian culture at large, it's actually because they're striving to please man instead of God. I mean, how did they get
yeah,
so popular in the first place? Again,
right,
not saying that this is the case all the time, but sometimes we need to be wary um of that as well. I think that's a really, really fascinating, point. I don't think I've ever heard that made, but I don't disagree with you. I think, we absolutely should be encouraging original music,
yeah,
within the local congregation. Not every congregation like, I guess my question is, if your congregation's big enough, like yours is 1,000 people, there is I mean,
sure,
obviously, you attend there, so, like, there are gonna be people in
hmm,
there that are able to write songs like that.
yeah.
What about for smaller congregations that maybe don't have that ability? Like, they don't have somebody in there that feels like they're able to do that, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I honestly think that everywhere I've gone, even in the little places, there's usually a person, and it's
Yeah.
somebody that you wouldn't pick out of the crowd. Like, you maybe know they play guitar and they happen to do some poetry, you
Mm,
know? Because, like, again, the difference is that we're not trying to make a mass marketable tune. We're trying to
mm,
reach our people with their needs. So, like, The Struggle, for example, that was not meant to go all over the place. That's a song that I've got out. I wrote that for some folks in my home church who went through a hellacious week. I mean, horrible. They had their one car broke down. One kid went to the ER. Another kid had um, essentially had like a kind of a mental break.
mm,
And they had it all in a week. And I wrote it for them, and it didn't sound like a pop song. It sounded like a beach rock tune. Okay, it was hokey, and I wrote it for them because I felt led to, and
mm,
that ministered to them. And then they said, "We want to send you to Nashville and get this recorded." You know,
mm.
so I
Yeah.
I think
I
we
think
want to,
writing
yeah,
with more specificity is needed, not just in worship music, but in Christian
right,
music at large. We make these mass-produced songs that are
right,
supposed to apply to millions of people, and
right,
that's where you get these kind of, like, vague, platitudes that we get about, like, mountains and valleys and, all sorts of
yeah,
nature imagery and all that stuff, because it's
yeah,
like you have to write mass market, and what a 50-year-old man is gonna be struggling with is going to be completely different than what I'm going through versus a teenager versus whatever, so I totally agree with you there.
yeah, yeah. It's I don't think it's good for me to say, well, this artist is doing it right. You
Mm,
know, it's better to say that. Like, there are some artists that I like what they're doing, and I think it's theologically accurate. But I think models are better. Like, I'm a fan of Sam McCabe. Like, that's a guy that I've mentioned where he's like, I'm not getting everything right, but I'm in a local church. I'm
Mhm.
trying to write for my church and my body. And if other stuff happens, cool. If it doesn't happen, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the model we should take. Like, who's the artist that you don't know about in your church body? That's quietly writing songs to God that you're not aware of because you just want to blast Elevation all day long
Yeah.
because it's the hype, band or whatever. And, um,
No,
and Elevation doesn't know you or what you're going through. So,
yeah, I agree with you completely. I think if, even to take that point and broaden it out, and we've already said this, but just more more seeking the Lord in the beginning of the process, more care put into the song choosing for each week, whether
mhm.
that is a local congregation song or, you know, maybe it is a song written for, I guess, quote unquote, a mass market, but it fits specifically in with
Yeah,
whatever the sermon is about. It's related very clearly to that, and that's being led by God too. Just seeking the Lord instead of the approval of man more in our churches. Um, looking at, on I'll criticize on both ends of the spectrum. If you're a church that's really tiny, um, working on the excellence of your musicians, shepherding them to
yeah,
be able to lead and play with excellence, um, and making sure that you are executing the songs well. I've talked about this before. Thinking about the keys that you're putting your worship songs in. Do not put worship songs in keys that are too high for most of your congregants to sing in. That's a very real issue. So just thinking about it from that perspective. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, churches that are massive, mega churches, you do not have to hire outside of your church.
yeah,
Mega churches do not have to do that. Does that mean that you're going to get the most professional sounding musicians? Maybe not. But you have thousands of people who attend your churches, and so go within your own body to find people. Make sure
yeah,
that they're solid in their walk with God before they go up on stage in front of a bunch of other people. Doesn't mean that they have to be perfect, but you want Christians up there for sure at the bare minimum. And then yeah, just production is great. But be conscientious of if it's too much, because sometimes it
yeah,
can be.
yeah,
Sometimes the production is a distraction and not necessarily like a gift or a help in terms of singing. And I think that you and I have kind of both said similar things in terms of that. And I think that that is super cool because you and I are different denominations.
mhm,
I'm in the process of becoming Anglican. You're, like you said, Reformed Charismatic. So we come from two different denominations within Christianity, but it's kind of the similar thing of like, this is a cross denominational issue.
yeah,
Like, you know,
for sure. It's a big thing. I'm actually a huge Anglican fan, so y'all are dope. I
I like it.
I almost
Um,
took a position at a Reformed Anglican Continualist church. If you can,
Cool. Very
they
cool.
they were unique bag for sure.
Yeah, and I want to clarify to anybody listening to, like we're in the conservative Anglican denomination, we're in the ACNA, so
Yeah,
this is not your run of the mill Episcopal pride flag up on the building type of church. But it's a
praise
beautiful,
God.
yeah. But I think it's a beautiful tradition. And do you have
Yeah,
any final thoughts on the whole worship thing? Anything you didn't get to say or wanted to discuss?
yeah, yeah. Man, just thinking about that last question, like, I want to encourage anybody that listens to this. Just because you don't have big influence everywhere and people don't know your name does not mean that your art is less than or secondary. God made you and stuck you at your church and gave you those gifts for you to share them.
Yes.
And whatever door opens, whether you get to lead worship or whether you need to share those with your pastor or whether it's a small group, or even if maybe you do get some larger influence, like get after it, steward the gift that God's given you. It's not meant to go hide in the sand, and
Yeah.
He's meant for you to multiply that. So
Yeah, and to go off that, a deep influence is more important than a wide one.
yeah,
Having a wide influence is great if that's what the Lord blesses you with, but again, it's not about seeking numbers. It's about how do I minister to the people that God has already put in my path, the people around me? How do I change their lives to honor God more? And how can they change mine? And it's if churches had that perspective of bloom where you're planted, minister where you are at, to the people in your congregation already, the growth is going to take care of itself. You know.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
All right,
Um,
Jacob. Well, where can people find you? Where I know your music is on Spotify. Is it under Jacob Adam Davis? I want to make sure I'm getting that
it is.
correct.
That's my full name, because there are 8 Jacob Davises, and I'm not trying to be lost in a sea of my own name.
I know I almost made this awkward disclaimer that because my husband's name is Jacob, and I was like, we have different last names, so I think it's pretty evident that we are not married to each other. But yes, Jacob is a very, very, very common name. So make sure you guys go to Jacob Adam Davis if you want to
Yeah.
find his music. Where else can we find you?
Yeah, I'm on every streaming platform that's a major one, so it's like 35-ish or so.
Yep.
My website's called jadmusiclife.net. It was .com, but the company that owned my domain went under, so I had to, like, switch it recently.
Ooh, okay.
It was
.net. Yes.
super not fun, but you can find it in those places. I love coming to churches to train people, and I'd love to come and play if anybody wants to have me out. And I'd like for us to be able to play together this year if we can make it happen.
Me and you? Yeah. I think
Yeah,
that would be really fun. We live on opposite ends of the country.
yeah,
And so it's really tough. We did a live stream on Instagram together, where we got
hmm
to play some music for each other. It'd be super
sure.
fun to play together. If we are ever on the East Coast, or if you are ever out here, even in California, West Coast, Phoenix, whatever, we should absolutely like do a show. I think that'd be really, really fun.
Dude, sign me up. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just picturing like people like, okay, there's jazz and there's Americana emo, and what's happening at this particular event?
I mean, people already think our music is like this weird fusion anyways, and so I don't
Sure.
think they're gonna be surprised by anybody we do a show with, as long as the other person, loves the Lord. You're on Instagram as
Yep.
well, right?
Yep. Yep. It's the same tag. It's JAD Music Life. I tried to make
Nice.
it as simple as I could for people. And for my older folks, if you're on Facebook, it's just my full name, music. So it's Jacob Adam Davis Music.
Oh, you got a
I, don't-
Facebook. We don't
I
have a
do.
Facebook, but we do get asked about it, but, yeah, and I will have to have you back on here so that we can talk about MK stuff, missionary kid stuff. That is a whole